All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first installment for the spring semester of the Research and Language Learning series. This is a series that was started with the University of Illinois, Arizona State University, and American Councils for International Education, with the idea that language learning is an integral part of the research process, but the stories of how we learn language often don't come through in our final research projects. So this has been an initiative to put a spotlight on how people learn different languages spoken in our region and how that can influence someone's research journey and process. I am delighted today to be introducing our speaker, Harrison King, who is a PhD candidate in late modern European history at the University of California, Berkeley. He holds a BA from Miami University and an MA in Comparative History from Central European University. He has received a number of awards and fellowships for his research, including the Cohen-Tucker Dissertation Research Fellowship. His current research focuses on the intersection of Imperial Russian and Soviet and Ottoman Turkish history in the Caucasus. The title of his talk today is The Elegance of the Eggplant, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Georgian Language.
All right, thank you very much, Catherine, for that nice introduction. Just to double check, can all of you hear me clearly? Okay, great. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to the whole SRS team, Joe, Serenity, Olga. Thank you very much for convening today's meeting and for inviting me to share my experiences studying the Georgian language and conducting research in Georgia, where I've been based on and off for the past 3.5 years. Let me go ahead and share my screen. We can get rolling. Okay, just to double check, can everyone see what I see?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Let me just minimize this box. All right, so good evening from Tbilisi. Good morning to those of you tuning in from the United States. As Catherine mentioned, my name is Harrison King. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of History at UC Berkeley, hoping to finish my dissertation in the next year to a year and a half. And it's my great pleasure to be with you here virtually. It's a great honor to participate in this language learning and research series. And I've entitled my talk today, The Elegance of the Eggplant, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Georgian. This is a bit of admittedly a goofy and off-the-wall title that will, I hope, become a bit more clear towards the middle of the presentation. It's a nod to a running joke between some of my former teachers and myself, as well as a nod to the film Dr. Strangelove. Before I sort of give an overview of what I'm going to talk about in the next half hour or so, I have just a few disclaimers before we get started. So the first, I want to disabuse all of the viewers here of the notion that I have somehow mastered the Georgian language, that I'm completely fluent. I speak without any mistakes, and I've mastered all of the complexities of this language. That is far from reality. In truth, this is a language that I'm still actively learning. It's a language that's relatively new for me. I started only in 2020, sort of at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when I was in my early 30s, a time when my brain was no longer the sponge it used to be in my 20s. So it was a challenging language learning experience, but one that I really have come to cherish. And so I'll be sharing words of wisdom today, but please keep in mind that this is a language that I'll be struggling with probably for the rest of my professional career. Secondly, Georgian was to some extent a little bit of an accident for me. I hadn't initially planned to dedicate this much time to learning Georgian. My original thinking was that I would go to Georgia for a summer, sort of develop a foundation to supplement my main research languages, which used to be Russian and Turkish. But over the course of time, and after enrolling in a language course, it switched from being a mere hobby to a passion and an obsession. And so Georgian has indeed become my main language of daily communication and a third main research language. And then lastly, I won't speak about this explicitly today, but I just want to emphasize at the outset of the talk that even though I will be sharing some nostalgic reminiscences about learning Georgian and sharing some happy moments from the past and conducting research here and learning the language, I do want to acknowledge that this is a very difficult and stressful time for a lot of my Georgian colleagues, friends, and family members. The political situation here has rapidly deteriorated. And so I ask that everyone keep Georgia on your mind in the days, weeks, months ahead. Very important time to be paying attention to the situation here. And so I hope my presentation will be in the spirit of thinking about better days to come for Georgians in Georgia. So with those preliminary remarks in mind, let me proceed to a quick overview of my presentation. I'll give you just a quick rundown and then we'll get into the substance. So my path to studying the Georgian language has been a very long and winding one. And it started roughly about 15 years ago when I went on a hiking trip with a friend of mine to northeastern Turkey to actually admire some of the Georgian cultural heritage in northeastern Turkey and the region around Artvin, and got to see some very, very beautiful but dilapidated Georgian medieval churches. And that was really my first encounter both with the Georgian alphabet, which I'll explain later, and also with Georgian history and culture. And I didn't initially come to Georgia directly. My entry point into the South Caucasus was actually through Azerbaijan, where I worked for a year as a Fulbright English teaching assistant. I had studied Russian and Turkish in college and wanted to live in a country where I could use both languages. And so Azerbaijan initially appealed to me as a starting point for understanding the contemporary Caucasus. But over the course of my time there, I became increasingly interested in Georgia. Fast forward a few years to mid-2020, at the height of the pandemic, I had finished my qualifying exams for my PhD program and found myself stranded in the United States with nowhere to go. It wasn't possible to travel in the summer of 2020, and I was looking for ways to improve my language skills. And so I got very lucky and stumbled upon the American Council's Eurasian Regional Language Program, which is how I learned Georgian for 4 consecutive semesters on Zoom. So I'll talk about my experience with exclusively online instruction a bit later in the presentation. And then for the next few sections, I want to share just a few experiences moving from online lessons to the Supra table, to the Georgian feast table, and sort of share how it was using Georgian in my everyday life over the past 3.5 years, because it has been a totally transformative experience for me. Then I'll share a few words about doing archival research in Georgia today and talk about some of the archives and the material that can be found in them in Georgia, talk about a few of the sources that will be in my dissertation and how I've interpreted them, and then conclude with some parting thoughts about the importance of studying Georgian and what to keep in mind if you're planning to embark on learning Georgian in the future. One other thing I'd like to do here at the outset, rather than tack this on at the end of the presentation, is to give a small tribute to my language learning team. So as they often say, it takes a village. And so this is my village team that saw me through 4 very intensive semesters of online Georgian language instruction. So these individuals on the screen are some of my language teachers, my language conversation partners, program administrators, all of whom were just tremendously helpful and delivering a very rewarding and very rigorous language learning experience. I basically started learning Georgian from scratch. I knew only a few letters of the alphabet and a few phrases, and they really brought me up to speed in no time. And so I want to teach everyone a phrase here in Georgian today, Amerikos abjoebs gaumarjus. So long live or cheers to American councils. This program is truly remarkable, and I'll say a few more words about the structure of it a bit later. And I'll also, just as an aside, say that my imperfect command of the language is nobody's fault but my own. So all mistakes that I continue to make, all the things that I forget from our lessons, and some of the assignments that I never finished are nobody's fault but my own. But I am eternally grateful to all of the people here on screen for teaching me Georgian and helping me conduct my research here. Okay, so I want to rewind a little bit and take you back to the spring of 2010. Which is when I took a trip to northeastern Turkey as an undergraduate student studying abroad in Istanbul. I had a sort of fascination with the eastern parts of Turkey at that time. I was studying the Russian language and Russian history and was sort of interested in legacies of the Russian Empire and sort of the multi-ethnic makeup of eastern Turkey. And so I decided to take a trip with a friend to the region of Artvin. And we initially had come here to do some whitewater rafting. So we had, tourism purposes in mind. But because the water conditions weren't good, we ended up taking a couple of day hikes to some medieval churches dating back to the kingdom of Tau Klarjeti in the medieval period. And so my very first ever encounter with the Georgian script, as far as I recall, the moment that really stands out to me most vividly was the advertisement that you see here on the screen. I knew what the Georgian alphabet looked like, but of course I couldn't make heads or tails of it. It was impossible for me to decipher. And it was only many years later when I went back through my photo archive and dug up this photo that I could actually translate it. And so what this says is your Georgian brother Muho and Hotel Agara in the town of Yusufeli, Turkey. So I wanted to have this slide because I think this is literally the first time that I really looked at and studied something written in Georgian and was just amazed by the beauty of the script. And it sort of piqued my curiosity at the time as something that I might want to return to in the future. And so over the next couple of days, we hiked out through mountain valleys like this near Yusufeli to a couple of remote churches, one of which is pictured here. It's known as Otkta in Georgian. And this is one of the most important cultural artifacts from this medieval Georgian kingdom, Tau Klarjeti, that remains within the borders of Turkey today and can be visited. And so I didn't know it at the time, but less than a decade later, I would be returning precisely to this region, to the Georgian-Turkish borderlands, as the subject of my dissertation, which I'll get into a bit later. But as I said at the outset, my initial entry point into the South Caucasus was through Azerbaijan. As I said earlier, had studied Russian and Turkish, and after college, I worked for a year as a research assistant at a think tank in Washington, D.C., where I was studying the contemporary politics of the South Caucasus, and specifically some of the unresolved conflicts across the region at that time, including places like Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria. And so I didn't exactly know what I wanted to do next, but I knew that I wanted to have some time on the ground in the Caucasus region, learning at least one new language and getting to know the region firsthand. And so I applied and was very lucky to receive one of these English teaching assistantships to teach English in a few universities in Azerbaijan. I was based for one semester in Baku and for one semester in the city of Ganja in Western Azerbaijan, which is relatively close to Georgia's border. And I basically was teaching English to college students at various levels. I didn't have a whole lot of guidance. I didn't really have many teaching materials. I sort of had to initially fly by the seat of my pants until I sort of understood where my students were in terms of their grasp of English and then design courses based on that. But it was an absolutely incredible experience. I first taught in Ganja at the foreign language faculty, which you can see on the bottom two slides, the facade of the university and the faculty where I taught. And then in the second semester, I moved to the capital city of Baku and taught at the Baku Business University and the American American Center of Baku, where I taught academic writing. And so it was during this time that I was using my Turkish and Russian and also very slowly, admittedly, picking up Azerbaijani. It was really only the second semester where I took formal instruction and started to hunker down and learn the language seriously. But it was also during this time that I started to get interested in Georgian because my friends and I who were teaching in this region would often meet up in Tbilisi. That was the meetup point for my friends in Georgia and Armenia. So, once or twice a semester, we would gather in Tbilisi, to decompress, to let our hair down, so to speak, and to reflect on our experiences in different cities around the region. And so on one of those visits, I managed to pick up a copy of Dodonuk Iziria's very, very good beginner's Georgian through the Hippocrene series. And I didn't really have big ambitions to study the language at that time. I was mostly just tinkering with survival phrases and numbers. But that was my first exposure to the Georgian language. And I sort of kept it in my back pocket as something that I might want to return to in the future, but I didn't have time to devote to in my time as a teacher. And so fast forward a few years, I can speak in the Q&A maybe about what came between them. I enrolled in my PhD program at Berkeley in 2017. And at the end of my first year, which was very rewarding but very exhausting, I moved to Tbilisi for a summer to do some preliminary research. And I still didn't really know any Georgian. I was relying very heavily on my knowledge of Russian, which I had studied for many years, but was starting to get increasingly more interested in learning Georgian. And one of the ways that I wanted to do that was to actually visit the region that I would be writing about. And so I took a trip for the first time to one of Georgia's border districts known as Hamske Javakheti. And I wanted basically just to see the places that I was going to be reading and writing about. I've always prioritize that as someone who studies the history of this region, that you must also immerse yourself in the environment, get to know locals who can narrate their history for you. And so I visited the fortress of Chertvisi, which is visible here on the left-hand side, as well as the famed medieval cave city of Vardzia, where Queen Tamar once resided. And this trip really piqued my interest, and I felt like I was finally inching closer to the decision to take the plunge into Georgian. So again, fast forward 2 more years, and we come to the American Council's Eurasian Regional Language Program, which I can honestly say completely changed my life. I had initially planned to enroll in this program in Tbilisi to learn Georgian in a classroom in Georgia's capital. But because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the entire program got moved online on fairly short notice. And my teachers did a wonderful job of converting everything to a Zoom format. And so I just wanted to share a few screenshots of some of the learning materials that I used. So on the left-hand side, you'll see a textbook. This is one of the few textbooks available on the market. There's really not a whole lot of learning materials out there to learn Georgian, but this was a really great foundational resource that I used across all 4 semesters that I learned Georgian. But one thing I really admire about my teachers and the way that they designed our curriculum is that they basically, aside from the grammatical exercises that we did on a daily basis, they designed everything else from scratch. And they did it in a way that was tailored to my own needs as a student. And this is the first language learning experience I've ever had in my academic career where it was a one-on-one session, day after day, Monday through Friday for 4 semesters. So very, very intense. But to give you a few other examples of activities that we would do, I would sometimes be given songs and would be asked to plug in the missing words, and then we would review the sentences together. The third image is the first ever handwritten text that I learned to read in Georgian, which initially looked completely daunting and overwhelming to me. But by the time the 3rd or 4th semester rolled around, I could actually make sense of this because the training had been so rigorous. And so that's the autobiography of a famous Georgian artist named Elene Ekhlediani. And then lastly, one of my main teachers, Nino Skritladze, very kindly put together a short story to sort of test my knowledge of grammar and vocabulary at that point. So it was material specifically designed for my skill level. And I think these images really encapsulate the program as a whole. So not only did I have this very intensive one-on-one instruction every day, there was also a very active lecture series, both in English and in Georgian, that I attended on a weekly basis. And I also was encouraged to really push my language learning to the limits. So I often gave verbal presentations each semester, despite the fact that I felt my language skills weren't up to snuff. And I think that's one of the huge benefits of an intensive program like this. It is sort of like a boot camp, and you're expected to sort of use what you have as soon as possible. And so it really is the fastest I've ever learned a language in my career. And that's all thanks to the hard work my teachers put into this. A more humorous example. So why did I give my presentation the title, The Elegance of the Eggplant? So my teachers found out pretty early on that I was obsessed with the Georgian eggplant roll, which is one of my favorite Georgian dishes, hands down. And it's called in Georgian the Badrijani Niguzit, or the Niguziani Badrijani. And so my task was twofold. First, to actually cook this dish, and then to submit a summary of how I had cooked it in Georgian using all of the appropriate verbs, which was definitely a challenge. And then I had to come up with a sort of marketing ploy to promote the eggplant as one of Georgia's finest exports that should be, the backbone of the Georgian economy. And so while the slide that you see here is not aesthetically the most beautiful, the point was to really practice the Georgian that I was learning. And so this became a sort of inside joke, a Facebook legend within the American Council's community. So this is one of the more entertaining assignments that I had in my 2nd semester of learning Georgian. And to give you a glimpse of what our day-to-day lessons look like, these are 4 screenshots of our courses in action. And they show different things. So the top 2 screenshots are from my classes with my main teacher, Nino Skritladze. We're reviewing my homework assignments, talking about the different tenses for verbs and correcting my mistakes, breaking down the verbs and sentences so I understand everything. And then on the bottom, on the left, I'm watching a mini lecture given by one of my language partners, Eka, who very kindly gave a very comprehensive overview of the kingdom of Tao Klarjeti, where I had initially encountered the Georgian language for the first time back in 2010. So the church that you see pictured on that slide is the same place that I had hiked out to as an undergraduate student in 2010. And then on the bottom right is Natia Putkaradze, the head of our whole language learning program, teaching me the present perfective tense, which ended up being a particularly challenging aspect of Georgian grammar. And so, I remember in the pandemic period, there was lots of anxiety about this being the age of distraction, an age when students were having trouble focusing, their attention spans were flagging, etc. But I found the opposite to be true. I was initially skeptical that courses exclusively on Zoom would be successful, but because I'm a visual learner, I actually found this format to be extremely effective. And the pandemic ended up being a sort of blessing in disguise that I had so much time as I was sitting at home in the United States to devote to the language. And so this is why I continue to sign up for Georgian classes semester after semester, because I sensed that there was a lot of progress. And I had my teacher's undivided attention for several hours a day. So on the one hand, I had nowhere to hide. I had no other classmates, so I was under the spotlight all the time, but that only improved my language skills. So I'm very, very grateful that I had this opportunity. At the same time, it's not all fun and games. Learning Georgian is a slog. It's an extremely challenging language. As many of you undoubtedly know, Georgian belongs to its own language family, the Kartvelian language family, which only includes other languages spoken within Georgia and across the border in Turkey. So languages such as Svan, Laz, and Megrelian. So it really doesn't have many ties to neighboring languages. And sometimes you just have to spend many long hours, sometimes many long weeks, going through verb charts like the one that you see in front of you on the screen here. This is an Excel sheet that one of my teachers and I developed over the course of a whole semester. And these are just the first 18 lines of a much longer Excel spreadsheet where I was learning how to conjugate verbs in every tense. And this took me the better part of a semester to learn the last category, the present perfect, which is extremely challenging. So while I think Georgian tends to look overwhelming and daunting at first, as soon as you take the plunge, you start to make sense of it, but then the learning curve quickly ramps up again, and it ends up being very humbling. So one must simply spend many long hours staring at things like this and practicing and doing repetitive exercises to get the hang of it. So after a full calendar year of studying Georgian online, finally, I saw the light at the end of the tunnel, and the pandemic was beginning to recede. And so in September, October of 2021, I finally managed to move to Georgia, where I had planned to spend the first few months of my research, working in archives in Batumi and Tbilisi. And so I have just a few images on screen of my experiences at that time. So I was able to visit the American Council's office for the first time and learn that my teachers were actually real human beings and not holograms on Zoom. I was able to visit the statue of the famous Tbilisi-born Armenian film director, Sergei Parajanov, who I had given a presentation about during the program. I met with one of my first instructors, Shota Papava, who's pictured at the bottom left. We went to a restaurant called Shemo Mechama, which is one of my favorite Georgian words, which basically means that I ate to my fill, or I ate until I couldn't eat anymore, and then continued to eat further. And so I finally, after all of this time being hunkered down at home and going sort of stir crazy that I couldn't travel, I was finally able to come and start my research after a year and a half delay. And it was a really memorable semester for me. And I initially started traveling in the region of Ajara, which is where I started my research. It was really important to me that I get out of the sheltered environment in which I had learned Georgian and try to engage in conversations with locals in all of the places that I traveled to. And so the photos you see on the screen here are from two separate trips to the highlands of Ajara outside of Batumi, where I was treated like royalty as a complete stranger. They laid out the feast table, as you can see on the top, to sample the local Ajaran cuisine. And it was really my first time engaging in sort of extemporaneous conversation, not in a classroom environment. And it really helped me to develop my language skills quickly. And so The downside to being a historian is that you're stuck in the archive, typically from Monday to Friday, if you're trying to get work done. And so it's really only on the weekends that you have time to travel. But I tried to take advantage of that as much as possible and to see as much of Georgia as I could. And these are just a few more images from different regions of Georgia, from the Black Sea coast to the wine region of Kakheti to Kazbegi on the Russian border. And then on the bottom, the outskirts of Tbilisi and the region of Samtskhe-Javakheti. And so throughout that first semester, I really tried to travel as much as I could because I had read and learned so much about Georgian history, culture, and cuisine over the past year. I really wanted to experience it firsthand. And so I was very lucky to be invited to a Georgian supra, which you can see on the bottom right, the first time I had ever witnessed a proper Georgian feast. It was a really amazing experience, also very humbling because I was attending a feast in a different region of Georgia where they speak in a very, very fast dialect. And so despite the fact that I had studied Georgian intensively for a year, I was completely overwhelmed and understood almost nothing that the Toastmaster or the Tamada had said that day. So I realized that I still had quite a lot of work to do as I was learning to speak Georgian in Georgia. And then one of the great joys of living here for so long is that I eventually met the woman who would become my wife. And I've spent a great deal of time getting to know her hometown, her family, and her social circle. And they live in a region called Upper Imereti. And she hails from the town of Chiatura, which has become a real second home for me and a place where my language skills have improved vastly as a result of her family's generosity and hospitality. And I just wanted to share a couple of quick anecdotes about this region in particular, because they're sort of legendary throughout Georgia for being funny people, for having a great sense of humor, and also for speaking very fast. And so to give you a couple of examples of that, on the top right, you'll see a sort of elongated map of Georgia. The word for Georgia in Georgian is Sakartvelo, the land of the Georgians. But if you look closely, you'll notice that the capital Tbilisi is not in the correct geographical position. It's actually where the city of Kutaisi should be. And because Kutaisi is also located in Imereti, I think the message here is that Imereti really is the cultural capital of the country. So I got a kick out of this map. And then the bottom two slides are two very, very popular pop culture icons who sort of pose as rappers in their hometown of Chiatura. Their names are Tope and Tanjula. And they speak in the Imeretian dialect that I'm gradually trying to learn. So the title of their song pictured on the bottom left is called Twins Gevi Martebit, which in quote unquote proper Georgian would be Twins Gavi Martebit, which would be translated as we're also going to stand up tall, or we'll also straighten up. And so this is a sort of rap video poking fun at their hometown, at some of the personalities in their hometown, even as they try to put Chiatura on the map as one of the cool places in Georgia. And so that video has reached almost 2 million views within Georgia and is a huge hit. And then the same two actors play the role of those boys' parents, Nugzari and Luisa. And so on the bottom right, you can see Nugzari visiting the local cemetery where he's giving toasts to deceased ancestors and loved ones, but is getting involved in other sorts of shenanigans at the same time. And so these two figures in particular have been a great window for me onto the local culture there. All right, so now shifting to the latter half of the presentation about my research experiences. Catherine, please let me know if I'm running short on time, and I'll do my best to wrap up. When I first came to Georgia, my strategy was to start at the local level and then gradually zoom out. So I had only planned to be in Georgia for about 3 to 4 months, half of which I would spend in the city of Batumi on the Black Sea coast, and half of which I would spend in Tbilisi. For many reasons, mostly because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I wasn't able to go to Russia and ended up extending my time in Georgia by several years, which is not something I anticipated doing, but it really changed the whole direction, not only of my dissertation, but of my life. And so the first month I spent in Georgia as a historian, a practicing historian, learning to work in archives, was in Batumi at the archive of the Ajaran Autonomous Republic. And this was an absolutely incredible experience, a real dream come true for someone working in archives really for the first time. So as a near total stranger, they really rolled out the red carpet for me. They welcomed me with open arms. They were extremely hospitable. As you can see in the picture on the bottom right, I had coffee, tea, and sweets on my desk on a daily basis. They brought me more documents that I could possibly handle, as you can also tell in the photo. So it was a really rewarding experience being treated like that. I was really touched by it. And I think what helped is that from the very first day, I made a decision to speak Georgian as opposed to Russian. I didn't do this for political reasons. I did it merely to get better at speaking Georgian for practice sake. But it completely changed the dynamic that I had with the archivists, and it sort of set the tone for the years to come. I was able to immediately break through the ice, to establish really warm relations with this institution and with other people in town who really made my project successful. And so I include this blurb from their website, not to toot my own horn or to be pretentious, but just to show you what an amazing welcome I received from the archivists here. So it was a really memorable experience that I still cherish to this day. And it wasn't long after this little news blurb that they did that I was featured in the Archives Journal as well, which I thought was very sweet of them. And I think they overstated my abilities and my knowledge of Georgian history. They honored me with the title of cartphilologist, which was very nice of them to say, but I don't know if I've quite earned that title yet. I'll probably need to work for a few more decades before I can properly be called that. But as you can see here, I'm pictured with the head of the archive, who very generously came in for this photo shoot and to wish me good luck with my research. So what you see on my desk is a typical day in this regional archive, and the materials that I found here in this first month form in many ways the backbone of my dissertation. It's a really underutilized and underappreciated archive. And any of you with an interest in Ajara, in Georgia, or the Eastern Black Sea region, I highly recommend that you visit this place one day. It's a treasure trove. So that was my first month. I have one more slide, I think. The archivists there were also, they made sure that I had a good send-off. So when I was preparing to move to Tbilisi to do the next stage of my research, they smuggled in some hinkali, or some meat dumplings, for us to have on my last day at the archive. And we got to know each other better. They wanted to hear more about my personal life and what my plans were for the future. So it was a really memorable moment. And I was able to go back here the following year and continue my research again. So that was by far the biggest highlight for me in my first semester. Then I shifted to Tbilisi and worked for the most part for the next 2 years in the archives of the Georgian Ministry of Internal Affairs. And this archival ministry consists of 2 branches, the Georgian Communist Party Archive and the State Security, or KGB, Archive. And so this is where I did most of my research in Georgia. Because I focused largely on the Soviet period, these were the 2 most important archives for me. And again, like in Batumi, I opted to push myself to speak Georgian instead of falling back into my comfort zone in speaking Russian, which I had studied for a decade. I wanted to push myself to use Georgian even when I knew that my language skills weren't up to snuff to describe everything. And so I worked for the most part in the Communist Party Archive, which is a tremendous resource. They have the records of the Georgian Central Committee of the Georgian Communist Party. They have records of the Transcaucasian Regional Committee. So if you work on Azerbaijan or Armenia, or even the North Caucasus in the Soviet period, there are important documents in this archive for those countries or regions. And they also have, the autobiographies and memoirs of famous Georgian Bolsheviks. So it was a really fascinating place to work. And because it's located on the outskirts of Tbilisi, on the northern edge of the city, very few people actually go there on a regular basis. So I was often the only researcher in the reading room at a time. And so again, I had the archivist's undivided attention. And they were very sweet to me, invited me back for coffee, helped me track down obscure things that I wanted to read in the archive, and were generally just exceptional hosts. The same was true at the KGB archive. Where the subject matter, as you can imagine, was a little bit more grim. I was often looking at interrogation records or death sentences during the Stalinist purges, or transcripts of conversations with individuals who had been arrested by the Soviet secret police. So the material was often difficult to read and mostly in Russian, but there was some really excellent Georgian source material too. And so I really prioritized working in these two archives, and I can say more about them in the Q&A. And then finally, I wanted to give you a few examples of the kinds of documents that I'm working with in Georgian. So doing research on contemporary Georgian history, I think by default is a multilingual enterprise. So I have studied Russian and Turkish for years, which have been extremely helpful, but learning Georgian has enabled me to understand the history of this region in much more depth. It's almost inconceivable to me now that I could do without it. And so to give an example of one of the more challenging sources that I've worked with, on the screen here, you see a manifesto or a proclamation from a committee known as the Committee for the Liberation of Muslim Georgia. And this was a committee formed in the aftermath of the First World War that was advocating for Ajara and the wider Georgian-Turkish borderlands integration into the Georgian Democratic Republic on an autonomous basis. And so this is a declaration both in Georgian and in Ottoman Turkish. And what was initially difficult for me was that the vocabulary, the lexicon was very archaic. There were many words I had simply never seen before. Although I had studied Georgian intensively for a year, I wasn't really prepared to read documents like this because the vocabulary I had was more for everyday communication and everyday contexts. And so I once again just had to read a lot of documents of this nature to understand the language. And then I would see certain types of phrases or turns of phrase repeated over and over again in these sources, and it gradually became easier. But it was extremely challenging and took me 2 to 3 times longer to read documents like this than it would in Russian. And so it was a bit of an uphill struggle at first. So this is a document that I actually found in Turkey, where I worked for a few months, but it very much has to do with Georgian history. That same committee was led by a very famous patriotic intellectual named Mehmet Abashidze, and he was also one of the main editors and authors of a newspaper that was published between 1919 to 1921 called Samuslimano Sakartvelo, or Muslim Georgia, which again was sort of a mouthpiece for this committee advocating for Ajara and Muslim Georgia's integration into the Georgian Republic on an autonomous basis, so with a special status. And I'm working with sources like this because I want to have the backstory to why the Bolsheviks decided to introduce autonomy for this region. The Soviet authorities were not innovators in this respect. There's an important background context associated with Mehmet Abashidze's movement that's important for understanding why the Soviets made that decision later. And so I've been delving more and more into this earlier period, and it's becoming increasingly more complicated, but it's been very fascinating to research. So that's another example. Fast forwarding to the Soviet period, I just have a few slides left, almost finished. One of the more interesting documents that I found working in the Georgian Communist Party archive is the one that you see on the right-hand side, which is again in Georgian and in Ottoman Turkish, which is basically declaring autonomy for Ajara in early 1921. So these are the appeals of a famous Georgian Bolshevik named Filip Maharadze. And then on the left, you have an image from 1922, sort of showing Ajara as this showcase of Soviet socialism that would beckon to the Muslim masses of the Soviet Union as well as the Middle East. So Ajara was envisioned as this revolutionary bulwark that would promote Soviet ideology across borders. And so this is an original document. This is the document published in 1921. Very few copies of it remain. And so one of them is housed in the archive, and it's just one of hundreds of such documents that you can find there. And then moving further into the 1920s, which really is the main focus of my dissertation, I also look at handwritten reports from different political agitators or party activists, including female agitators who would do work in the villages of Ajara and report back to the officials in Batumi about their struggles and challenges and converting the quote-unquote peasant masses to socialism. And so this is an example of a source that I found in the Batumi archive in my first month that really gives a lot of local detail about what the process of Sovietization actually looked like on the ground. And so these are some of my favorite source materials because you get the author's personal opinions and impressions of what was happening. It wasn't something simply scripted as a speech at a party conference. I also deal with some visual sources, such as these multilingual Soviet anti-religious posters. These are from the late 1920s, when there was a campaign against the practice of veiling and against what were called customary crimes, such as polygamy or bride kidnapping or blood feuds. And so I like these because the one on the right, for example, is published in the three main languages of the South Caucasus: Georgian, Azerbaijani, and Armenian. And so what it says, and the one on the left with the veiled woman, it says Zirs Chadra, or down with the veil, down with slavery and down with seclusion. And on the right-hand side in Georgian at the top, it says, don't marry underage women off. So again, an example of Soviet propaganda against what they deem to be these backwards practices. And then finally, before I get to the conclusion, I deal with a lot of newspapers as well in Georgian. And something that I would encourage those of you in the audience who are thinking about doing projects related to Georgian history is to take a look at the National Parliamentary of Georgia's website. There is an absolute treasure trove of material that's fully digitized and downloadable. And this is an example of one such newspaper called Komunisti, or Communist. And in this particular issue, this newspaper is announcing the start of the Stalinist Cultural Revolution in Ajara with the opening of the Turkish and Ajarans Women's Congress. And so sometimes these newspaper sources are equally informative or even more so than archival documents. And so I've tried to take advantage of the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, on some of these Georgian institutions' websites. Okay, some concluding thoughts, and then I want to turn the floor over to you and hear whatever questions or comments you have. The advice I have here may seem on the surface to be a bit generic and cliche, but let me unpack these points very quickly. I've always had a sort of protest against the idea that we should study languages that are spoken by many millions of people or that are relevant for US national security or foreign policy interests. Georgian, at the end of the day, is spoken by, I think, 3.5 to 4.5 million people worldwide. It's a relatively small language. It's not spoken by that many people. But I think it's a really exciting and a really critical time to be studying it because there's a massive shift in the field of Russian and Soviet history to studying, quote unquote, the periphery. And I think the shift has actually been going on for a long time, but now there's a clear signal that this is, we should start paying attention to languages such as Georgian more often. And I think it really is a kind of a small boom time to be studying Georgian. There are lots of good programs here. There's a whole new generation of Georgian scholars doing really important path-breaking work, and lots of scholars in Europe and the United States following in their footsteps. So there really is no better time to be learning Georgian than there is now, and there's lots of good programs out there that I can recommend for it. Second, this may seem obvious, but learning Georgian really does unlock a whole world of possibilities as a researcher. And I say this as someone who primarily operated in a Russian language research environment for years. So one of the rewards of learning Georgian is that my hardwire has changed. I've completely reoriented my perspective on this region. I have an exponentially larger source base to pull from now. I can also understand how Georgians understand their own history and narrate their history. And you can engage with local sources and the local culture at a level that's much, much deeper than you could without Georgian. And so that has been really important to me as someone who has made Georgia the center of my dissertation and my professional career. Thirdly, again, might seem like fairly obvious advice, but one thing I think is particularly important with Georgian is to push yourself out of your comfort zone as much as humanly possible. I'm a very shy and introverted person, so I remember I was initially skeptical about scenarios in which I would have to put myself out there, maybe humiliate or embarrass myself in different situations. But one of the great things about living in Georgia is that you are often in that situation. So I've often been nominated to be the Toastmaster at feasts, which pushes me to speak, to really push my Georgian to its limits and to be comfortable with the level I have, or just engaging in daily conversation with archivists or people that you meet about the American culture or American politics or the political situation in Georgia. There are just numerous opportunities where I've been able to advance my language skills because I deliberately put myself in a situation where I would have to stretch my Georgian to its limits. And then finally, I want to emphasize, don't lose heart. So Georgian is a very difficult language. It has, when you're encountering it for the first time, these impenetrable consonant clusters, a very complex verb system, cases that one is not used to seeing, such as the ergative case for the past simple tense, lots of things that seem completely bewildering and daunting. But if you get past the initial points of frustration and hopelessness, the rewards are many. And there are days where you feel like you're defeated by the language and that you can't communicate effectively. But I would say, for the most part, it's the reverse. People are incredibly patient and gracious and extremely excited that you're making an effort to speak. And so living in Georgia has been a very positive language learning environment where I never really feel nervous about using the language skills that I've obtained. And so I hope that will be a similar experience for those of you learning Georgian now or in the future. Okay, I've droned on for far too long. Thank you all very much for your attention. Didi madluba, and I look forward to your questions and comments.